All right, so we are looking at part 3 of our Trig regression model project. For this part 3, you are going to need graph paper. Now, you are also allowed to use Desmos. If for any reason you can't do either of those, you may use plain or loose leaf paper, but you need to still use a ruler, use a straight edge, make it neat. It should look really nice. I'm not saying you have to draw every line and make it look like graph paper, but your graph should be very neat, very easy to follow. If for some reason you can't use graph paper. If we were in school, I would hand out graph paper to those of you who didn't have it, but obviously I can't do that. So I am going to allow, if you can't get graph paper, for you to do it on plain or lined paper. Just make sure you draw it very neatly. All right, and this part 3, you're going to create 4 graphs. Your first graph is going to be your graph with the actual data. Your second graph is going to be your graph for your linear predictions. Your third graph is going to be your graph for your exponential predictions. And your last graph is going to be your graph for your quadratic predictions. So let's talk about the graph. So, here's my piece of graph paper. The x-axis most people don't have too much of an issue with. For a lot of people, that's going to be years, or number of games, or months in a year. For some people, it might be months in a year, and this is going to be, January, February, March, April, May, etc. Of course, in your graphing calculator, you would have had to put them in as, 1 through 12. But you're going to have on your x-axis is going to be your independent variable. Then most people, if they're going to struggle, the struggle is usually with the y-axis. I want you to notice that for my y-axis, I went ahead and labeled it deaths due to heroin overdose. It's the labeling of the y-axis that people have difficulty with, or the numbering of it, I should say. If you have all of your data points, I've had people say, well, Ms. Solozzi, my data points all start at like 100,000, but then they only go up by a really small amount. So if I do that, all my data points are going to look all squished together in one little spot. If that's the case, then what I would say is you can do what's called a break in the graph. And, oh, sorry, I didn't do that very well. You just go like that. And then maybe it starts at 100,000. And then from 100,000, I can count by 2,000. 102, 104, 106, 108, 110. Or maybe I'm only going to count by 101,000, 102,000, 103,000. Or maybe I'm going to count by 20,000s after that. But whatever I count by, I have to be consistent. All right? Now, for me in my project on the heroin overdoses in Maryland, I do not need a break in the graph. I only need to go from 0 to 1,300, and so I'm going to have each line is going to stand for 100 deaths. So I, for my particular data, did not need a break in the graph. All right, and I would just keep going and number this. And then what I'm going to do, after I've set up my graph, labeled it, made it look nice, I only need to go to 1,300. I just went ahead and went to 1,400. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my actual data, and I'll plot my points. I would label this graph actual data for deaths due to heroin. I already know from the title of my, I'll go ahead and put in Maryland. All right, actual data, deaths due to heroin in Maryland. It's obvious that it's what years it is, it's obvious how I'm counting, and I would plot my points. Then, for a graph, so that's graph number 1. Graph number 2, I'm going to put deaths due to heroin in Maryland, and this is going to be predictions using linear model. okay, deaths due to heroin in Maryland. And I would still do each year, and I'm going to do my predictions. Now for my predictions, I might need to label differently. Maybe my predictions are going to go way beyond 1400. So for that second graph, I might have to label my y-axis a little bit differently or make it a little bit bigger. So, and then I will have a third graph where I do predictions using, and this would not say linear, it would say exponential. My fourth graph, predictions using quadratic model. And each time I have to draw a new graph, and I have to label it, make sure it's all labeled very clearly. So 4 separate, clearly labeled graphs with the x-axis and the y-axis appropriate for whatever numbers you have. That is part 3 of your project. So let's just review again. You're going to need 4 separate graphs. One for the actual data, one with the linear predictions, one with the exponential predictions, one with the quadratic predictions. And please make sure all graphs are clearly labeled. Let's write that down. Graphs, clearly labeled, x-axis, y-axis, title for the graph. Okay, make sure you count clearly on the x-axis. So x-axis you need to label and count. Y-axis you need to label and count. And give a title for the graph.